There are a large number of high-quality video games and respective games series. These include the likes of BioShock, Metal Gear Solid, God of War, and the like. Yes, there's no series that is without a black sheep or two, but when a game releases for these, you know it's going to be a banger. If there is one series in video games that has one of the highest pedigrees of all, that would be The Legend of Zelda. Its first entry released on the NES in 1986, and it featured a vast open world for the time and an elf-eared protagonist named Link, tasked to venture forth and save Princess Zelda by gathering pieces of the Triforce and defeating Ganon. It featured swordplay action, puzzle solving, and exploration, many elements that have continued throughout the series, as well as through the leap to 3D made in Ocarina of Time in 1998. There are over 30 Zelda games that have released in the last 35 plus years, with many older entries receiving ports and remasters so that younger generations can experience these fantastic games. To rank these, I'm going to be applying some rules. Before I go into these, do note I will be combining both the entirety of the 2D and 3D Zelda games on this list. This is a departure from when I separated them on my worst games on each series video. These are being combined because there aren't as many 3D Zelda games, and I wanted to ensure all of the games on this list will get enough time. If you see a game on this list, it's absolutely worth playing, especially the higher I go in my rankings. As mentioned, I'm going to be employing the following rules. Number 1, I will not be ranking any of the Phillips CDI games. It's just not going to happen. They wouldn't have appeared on the top 10 list anyway with how terrible they are. I'm also not ranking them because they've had such a low distribution and are really only available via emulation anyway. Number 2, no spin-off games either. This means the Tingle-based games such as Ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love, hope I'll never have to say that again, will not make the list. Number 3, no Zelda games that were on the BS Satellaview games will be in consideration either. These were games broadcast to Japan-only Super Famicoms between August 1995 and May 1999. There are no legitimate ways to play these currently, with even emulation struggling to capture them. Number 4, gimmick-based games that don't have any actual place in the timeline will not be ranked for consideration. This means no Link's crossbow training, Cadence of Hyrule, or Dynasty Warriors offshoots like Hyrule Warriors. And finally, number 5, cameos don't count either. This means no Smash Bros., Soul Calibur 2, NES Tetris, and so on. It's a lot of rules, isn't it? Just goes to show that Nintendo has not been chintzy about sharing Legend of Zelda properties in many different forms. Sometimes we get great products like Smash Bros. And Cadence of Hyrule, though unfortunately this also means we get Tingle games. I'm not saying that title name again. One last reminder, these are of course my own opinions. I've played a huge number of games in this series ever since the first one came out when I was a kid. I'm old, remember? This just means I've been playing this series for decades, but that does not make my opinion any better than yours or anyone else's who have played and loved this series. Now let's move on to ranking this awesome series. Number 10, Zelda II, Adventure of Link. NES, December 1st, 1988. Yep, I'm actually rating this higher than games like Oracle of Ages, Seasons, and even Minish Cap. But hear me out. Keeping in mind that this was the second game in the entire series, this made me think at the time that Nintendo was going to change the formula on every game in the series going forward. Of course, they went back to the standard 2D gameplay for the next 2 games after this, which really makes Zelda 2 quite unique. After all, it became a platforming action RPG with the inclusion of additional RPG elements like magic and a leveling system with experience points. The problem with this, of course, is that the game is hard. Very hard. One would say it's unfair at times. Regardless, it's still a solid Zelda game that is a fun outlier, though the story elements are quite bare in-game. Many games on the NES told a good part of their story in their instruction manuals, for example. I've got a number of great memories with this game due to growing up with it and having replayed it many times under no or low leveling challenges. Number 9, Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Nintendo 64, October 26, 2000. This game saved my sanity when I was a senior in high school. I had to write a 15-page paper about a company, so I picked Coca-Cola. I had a system where I would work on the paper for half an hour and then play Majora's Mask for the other half an hour. Nothing motivated me more to get all the work done in a few sittings than to complete this game. Seriously though, this was one of the better looking and running Nintendo 64 games. It does pull a lot of the assets from Ocarina of Time, but improves it a lot, such as streamlining the combat system and speeding up the menus. While not close to topping the story and dungeons of Ocarina, Majora's story is still quite good. As a Zelda game though, it's a lot more heavy on side quests, which is one of my lesser favorite things in the series. The repeating 72-hour time system is also really innovative, if we ignore the fact that this was already done in the movie Groundhog Day, 24 Hours There. The masks for Ocarina of Time are also pulled, but hugely expanded upon, with each of them having different purposes from just moving forward a side quest to becoming godlike in boss fights. I also liked how overall darker the tone was, from the end of the world theme to even as small as motion blur to add an ethereal look to some of the scenes and cinematics. It's no wonder this became such a cult hit and is definitely worth a playthrough. Number 8. Legend of Zelda Wind Waker, GameCube, March 24th, 2003, and Wii U, September 20th, 2013. I will readily admit that I was one of the haters that was disappointed when this game was revealed in 2001. A tech demo of a high-quality battle between Link and Ganondorf was shown before this, only for Nintendo to present a cartoony-looking game instead. It felt like the reveal to Super Mario RPG 2 all over again. Nintendo making a sequel looking very kiddie, which they really leaned into heavily with the Nintendo 64. Super Mario RPG 2 of course became Paper Mario and is an absolutely fantastic game, so I should have known that Wind Waker was going to be great too. I did play Wind Waker on the GameCube back when it first came out, and honestly I was pretty underwhelmed. I hated the first level's stealth section, though I dislike stealth in games overall. Sorry Metal Gear Solid fans. There also was what seemed like a lack of dungeons with roughly 7, though this did beat Majora's Mask, and that only had 4 dungeons in it. A continuance of a lot of side quests, though thankfully not as many as Majora, though that late game Triforce piece hunting was annoying as well. I wouldn't have even put it in the top 10 if it wasn't for the HD re-release on the Wii U. Maybe it was the streamlined gameplay, the improvements made on the Triforce piece hunting, or the crisper and clearer graphics. I just gelled with it more and had a much greater appreciation for what Wind Waker really did. There's not a lot of the base story, though what they did in the relevant call-outs to Ocarina of Time were handled so very well. While Zelda games generally have pretty decent music, marrying the music with the battle system increased battle immersion in a way that hasn't been done in a Zelda game before this, and honestly not really as well, barring something like Cadence of Hyrule. And finally, I also really loved the personification of Ganondorf as a person that was featured at the end of the game. I do wish more Zelda games would dig deeper into that part of the lore, but regardless, this is a wonderful game that is absolutely worth playing through. Number 7, Legend of Zelda Link Between Worlds, 3DS, November 22nd, 2013. This game very badly needs a port to the Nintendo Switch. As you know, I'm not a fan of the 3DS. From the overly gimmicky 3D aspect that has aged as well as milk, to the awful circle joystick, this is one of my least favorite Nintendo systems. Regardless, it is home to a bunch of fantastic games, with this one being no exception. I probably would even rate this higher if it could have been played on a better system. The game itself plays very much like Link to the Past. In fact, you could say it's a love letter to this original game. I felt like it took what Link to the Past did well, streamlined a lot of the gameplay, and added a bunch of intriguing aspects. Some of these include the item rental system to the non-linear way you can proceed to completing the dungeons. Let's not forget the unique portrait system, which allows Link to traverse across the world in quite a unique way. I loved how this made the familiar environments transform from the 2D overhead perspective to a 3D type look, which is funny since Link himself gets transformed into a 2D state a la portrait style. Sometimes, though admittedly not often, I felt that the environment and dungeons felt too similar to Link to the Past. This is often a tough thing to balance with games that want to pay homage to classics. Sonic Mania managed to balance this perfectly. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge did as well, the former pulling levels almost directly from Sonic 1 through 3 Knuckles. The soundtrack is very similar to Link to the Past, but just like everything with the game, it expands on it greatly. This game's absolutely worth a playthrough if you can get your hands on it, especially before the 3DS shop closes. Number 6. Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. GameCube, December 11th, 2006. Wii U, March 4th, 2016. I toughed my way through the Wii version first. I've got to say that I absolutely hated the motion controls for this. What powered me through were the interesting dungeons, the great story, and wonderful characters. While I did have a GameCube, I admittedly made the mistake of ignoring that system's version of this. My mistake was rectified, fortunately, once the HD version of Twilight Princess was released on the Wii U. I will admit that some of the graphics don't look as clean when compared to the Wii U's version of Wind Waker. Regardless, everything controls great since I literally can use a controller. I prefer the mature and dark storyline of Twilight Princess over Wind Waker's anyway. Though admittedly, Twilight Princess is not without its annoyances. For one thing, game developer Rare would be proud of the increased number of things Link has to hunt and find. From all the bugs to the increase from quarter to fifth pieces of heart, I see the spirit of Banjo-Kazooie and DK64 looking down at us and smiling. One thing both Wind Waker and Twilight Princess also have are areas where there are wide expanses and open fields where there's just sort of nothing there. Pursuant to Twilight Princess, this is probably for the areas where you battle on horseback, as there are a number of battles like that. Speaking of which, I loved the thematic battles in the game, and here Epona really shines. From jousting on the Bridge of Eldin against King Boblin, to protecting the wagon, to the final battle with Zelda in tow against Ganondorf, these just rocked. Even some of the non-horseback battles, like the final one against Zant, was literally crazy. I also loved the Western-themed battle at the Hidden Village. Just thinking about these battles alone make me wonder how I could only give this game 6th on my top 10. Then of course I remember how high a pedigree in quality Zelda games have, and remember the next 5 games are not only absolute classics, they're practically masterpieces. Number 5. The Legend of Zelda. NES, February 21st, 1986. From here on out, I could argue my top 5 Zelda games are perfect 10 out of 10s, if I gave them critical scores. Admittedly, each of them have their own various nostalgia biases, but they're all absolutely fantastic games in their own rights. Their negatives probably are minutiae that don't detract from the overall presentation, or possibly were limitations set upon them by the consoles they released on. Regarding this last point, the very first Legend of Zelda is a product of its time. Released very early in the life of the NES, and fairly early for the Famicom, it won't win any awards for graphics or something like soundtrack variety. Without a guide, it is very easy for new players of this game to get lost in this world. And this last negative point is actually one of its greatest positives, and I'd argue one of this series' largest strengths. Getting lost in a game and diving so deep into its world is what makes this specific title, the first Legend of Zelda, so good. Thankfully, if the player wants to move forward, they can use the internet. And I recall my brothers and I using the manual and clutching our Nintendo Power for dear life as we tried to help Link conquer Ganon and recover the pieces of the Triforce. Only one other title in the series as a whole managed to capture this feeling, and this is but one of many reasons why that title has yet to have been covered on my top 10 here. Yet. This game pioneered combat very well, which is something that the series has done a great job of handling in most of its titles. One thing about this title that's always stuck with me is its second quest. If you beat the game, or register your name as Zelda, your Link avatar during the file select shows Link holding a sword. This means that you can now play the game again, but things are very different. While the overworld itself is unchanged, locations for shops, items, secret rupees, and others have all changed. Even many locations of the dungeons have changed, and I'd argue here you would need a guide to find them all. Speaking in dungeons, these are so much harder than the first quest. So much so that the first quest is laughably easy in comparison. Seriously, the red bubbles that permanently take your sword? How the hell is that even fair? Okay, so the blue bubbles give you back your sword, but still, they're often located away from the action and require quite a bit of defenseless backtracking to reach them. If you want a true challenge, beat the second quest. Before the age of emulation and the virtual console, i.e. save states, I've only beaten it once without dying. Number 4. Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. Game Boy, August 6, 1993. Game Boy Color, December 15, 1998. Nintendo Switch, September 20th, 2019. This game is essentially Nintendo's way of trying to put a game like Link to the Past onto the Game Boy. Many aspects from it are peppered throughout the game. Any true fan of this game, though, like myself, will tell you that Link's Awakening is so much more. This is one of the first Zelda games I felt that had a truly deep story, one that seemed fun and fancy-free, yet held a deeper plot twist that wrenched at the player's heart as they delved deeper into the game and got to know the many fantastical characters and aspects of the island. With this game, you continue the tradition of fantastic combat, puzzle solving, and dungeons through 2D overhead view. I loved that this game didn't lean too heavily on the side quests, something I'm especially thankful of for these earlier Zelda games. What you as a player need to decide is which version of this game you'd want to play. There's the original Game Boy, which has been ported a few times, such as recently on the Zelda Game & Watch. The Game Boy Color one is probably the better version, as the colors add even more personality to a game already chock full of it. Its color dungeon that was added is nice, but it's honestly pretty superfluous, especially the attack or defense armor the player gains from beating that dungeon. Finally, there's the Nintendo Switch remake. While there are some slowdown issues, I loved how it seamlessly merged so many of the screen movements in larger screens, much like how Link to the Past originally worked. It's for this reason I could argue this is the best version. However, I'm not a huge fan of the cutesy art style in it. As you could tell by my reaction to Wind Waker, I prefer a more classic and or serious looking Zelda game. The Switch version also has a few quality of life improvements, my favorite being the controls. With the Game Boy and Game Boy Color versions, the player has to swap out the A and B buttons for everything, including Link's sword, shield, Pegasus boots, and even the ability to lift heavy objects with the power bracelet. Instead, the Switch permanently affixes many of these to the buttons on the Switch controller, allowing much more streamlined gameplay. I also loved the soundtrack, which is the largest one for the series at this time, and perhaps the best one up to this point. And finally, I loved all of the Nintendo cameos that were placed throughout the game. They weren't too heavy-handed, but were fun aspects in the game to see. But I personally loved most of all the island itself, only for it to fade away like a dream on a seagull's wings at the end. Number 3. Legend of Zelda Link to the Past, Super Nintendo, April 13th, 1992. This is one of the earlier video games released on the SNES, the third in the Zelda series, and it is an absolute classic. It reverts back to the 2D overhead style of play from the first entry and refines it to a level of perfection not seen again until Link Between Worlds. Everything is iconic from this game. The beginning music and Triforce animation, the first appearance of drawing the Master Sword, and of course, the clash between Link and Ganon at the end. Link not only has the whole overworld to traverse, but halfway through the game, the Dark World emerges as another place to explore, and with it, 8 additional dungeons to complete. This Dark World mirrors Link's own world, allowing for many dynamics that impact both if one's environment is affected enough. Access to the Dark World is done through several different portals, which allows Link to reach places he normally wouldn't be able to without use of them. This is especially the case as he can use the magic mirror to exit the Dark World at any point, again reaching places not normally possible. My only gripe for this game? I wish players could select and use items using the X, L, and R buttons, versus just assigning one item to the Y button. This is because this game greatly expanded the number of items Link had from the first entry that it is most similar to. The first Legend of Zelda had 8 selectable items, 3 sword strengths, and 2 different shields. Link to the Past expanded this to 21 selectable items, 4 sword strengths, and 3 different shields. Both games had 3 different levels of armor upgrades though. Usage of these items, as well as combat overall, feels very tight thanks to the great controls. Boss battles are often quite challenging though fair. Finally, the upgrade from the NES to the SNES saw the quality of the soundtrack increase dramatically, and with this game it shows. Hearing the upgrade of the main theme of the series that plays in the overworld, especially when compared to the first entry on the NES, promises the player an adventure on an epic scale, and this is a promise that is absolutely delivered too. For nearly 20 years, Link to the Past was my number 2 for all-time best Zelda games. It wasn't until the next entry that came out that saw Link to the Past get bumped to number 3. Number 2. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Nintendo Switch and Wii U, March 3rd, 2017. This is the first game for the Nintendo Switch and was meant to be the Wii U's last as well. In doing so, Nintendo bookended both systems with an absolute masterpiece, and perhaps the best Nintendo Switch game still to have come out. Upon awakening from a 100-year slumber, Link, bereft of all of his memories, searches his environment for some semblance of what has transpired since then. It is within the first hour of gameplay that he is gifted all the tools he needs for basic travel, the paraglider and the Sheikah Slate. Using this, the entirety of the world opens up to him with only a couple small hints to guide where Link must go next. The word open world gets thrown around a lot these days, but Breath of the Wild personifies this to a T. This game does what Skyrim does in regards to combat and exploration, but so much better. One great aspect this game holds over Skyrim as well is that it's a lot less buggy. Of course there are a few bugs here and there, but the game runs consistently and with few issues. People are also still finding new things and ways to take advantage of the system to this day. Some of them are extremely inventive too. The combat sees Link use swords, but also other items such as axes, bows and arrows, and heck, even tree branches. This is probably the most controversial aspect of the game, as all of the weapons and shields will break after too much use. Not even the Master Sword, once regained, isn't susceptible to losing its energy and becoming unusable for a time. Added into combat is the parrying mechanic, which can be difficult to perfect, but once it's successfully performed, feels great. Combat can also be viewed as quite innovative, in that players can find ways to just avoid it completely, or even tackle it from afar while still avoiding to be seen. The soundtrack is great too. While the music doesn't really have a number of killer tracks in it like Link to the Past or Link's Awakening, its purpose is far more subtle. It does a fantastic job reflecting environments, such as the sprightly music that plays while riding a horse in a field to the light piano keys that play while exploring a grassy plain. It also does a great job of ramping up tension when running into Guardians 2, adding to the cacophony of sounds and sights to fill the player with fear of getting fried by its laser. I suppose the biggest exception to this is the boss music and the song that plays when navigating outside of Hyrule before confronting Calamity Ganon. While not subtle, these songs do a great job of emphasizing the importance of beating these bosses and Link making his way to the final encounter. I think my only issues, if I really have any, would be the lack of larger dungeons that other Zelda games had. The 4 beasts were interesting, although sometimes the 3D mapping would confuse me if I was tired enough. Going through 120 shrines was fun, but they all look the same and don't replace the larger and varied dungeon environments. These are relatively small qualms, as so many of the positives really outweigh any of these potential negatives. Breath of the Wild is a masterpiece, tried and true. Number 1. Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Nintendo 64, November 21st, 1998, 3DS, June 19th, 2011. Make no mistake, this is the best game in the Zelda series and the best game on the Nintendo 64. I could make a very compelling argument that this not only is one of the best first-party Nintendo games ever made, but just one of the best video games ever. This was the first game in the Legend of Zelda series to move it from 2D to 3D, and just like the jump from Mario in Mario 64, Ocarina of Time nailed the landing and then some. The story is extremely compelling, the soundtrack is fantastic and fits the environments perfectly, and the characters in the game are quite memorable. Combat-wise, this was the game that introduced the Z-targeting system, something that has become a series staple since and has even been copied and used in other games as well. But all this doesn't make it better than Breath of the Wild. Both games also had great concepts of exploration, though in different ways. While Breath of the Wild excelled in open-world exploration, Ocarina of Time nails exploration through the different environments and especially the variety and size of its dungeons. In this way, these two sort of even out because of this. In my mind, two things put this game ahead of Breath of the Wild: nostalgia and its sheer importance. I remember being a young teenager playing Ocarina of Time for the first time. A feeling of awe hit me as I walked out into Hyrule Fields for the first time, seeing the vastness of the world expand upon me. I also remember being hit with deja vu a number of times throughout the game, instilling me personally with a feeling of familiarity that I couldn't quite nail, though it made me feel special for it nonetheless. Of course, later I would realize that this was because it pulled a lot of concepts from Link to the Past, such as pick up 3 accessories to get the Master Sword, have more dungeons to complete after that, fight Ganon, as well as many of the main characters' names were pulled straight from towns in Zelda II. These were devices used well by the creators of this game to initiate me, the player, into their world, and it worked well. The other reason why this is ahead of Breath of the Wild is just how important Ocarina of Time is to the Legend of Zelda series as a whole. This game is the reason why the timeline diverges in 3, with games like Wind Waker and Twilight Princess exploring the future of these said timelines. This split wasn't revealed until much later after the release of Ocarina of Time, but eagle-eyed fans were able to figure this out before it was officially released by Nintendo. It is for these reasons that it seals the #1 spot. As mentioned before though, everything in the top 5 slots are 10 out of 10 games in my mind, so really the order of these last 5 is really just apples and oranges. And that was my list of top 10 Zelda games. If you haven't gotten into the series at all for some reason, I absolutely recommend trying them, especially any of the top 5 I've listed. This top 5 at least are all available on the Nintendo Switch, either through the eShop, such as Breath of the Wild and Link's Awakening Remake, or through the Nintendo Switch Online, such as Ocarina of Time, Link to the Past, and Legend of Zelda I. What are your favorite Legend of Zelda games? Let me know in the comments section. Did you agree with my list or would you have ordered it differently? While you're there, please like, subscribe, and click that bell for notifications for when the next video is released. Thanks for watching and have a great day.